In April 2016, talks of a live-action Ivor the Engine feature film came up in the press, and the reaction was unusual, as in there was hardly any reaction to begin with. In this day and age, that's remarkable considering the internet usually goes gaga at the thought of a live-action or CGI reboot of something they've usually held onto since childhood. Let's face it, nowadays everything under the sun is being reimagined, retold, continued, and generally milked for every penny it's worth because the word nostalgia is basically a new synonym for profit. Unless you lose focus and go ridiculously over budget, or just lose the point entirely. Since the announcement of a live-action Ivor being made, little news has been revealed, but the reminder that the show was once mooted for feature film adaptations serves as a good segue into talking about the original creation. Fitting as the property is 60 years old in December. Sheesh, doesn't that make you feel mortal? Ivor the Engine was the brainchild of stage manager and children's television writer Oliver Postgate, who brought his stories to life with animator Peter Firmin through their joint company Small Films. The overall story of Ivor was pretty basic. Ivor is the fictional locomotive of the equally fictional Merioneth and Llantysilio Rail Traction Company Limited, situated in the not-so-fictional top left-hand corner of Wales. Ivor lives a relatively quiet life with his laid-back, happy-go-lucky engine driver Jones the Steam and his well-meaning Taskmaster Jobsworth colleague Di Station. Together they mingle with local communities and townsfolk, deliver the occasional mineral or clothing item, and most noticeably participate in the local choir. Although he demonstrates sentience and intelligence, Ivor doesn't speak. Instead, he communicates through a trio of baritone whistles off an old steam organ, which he obtained simply because he had the desire to express himself. Isn't that something we can all relate to? The first series of 6 episodes debuted on ITV in 1959. The ongoing story told us of how Ivor became interested in singing in the local choral society and how he obtained his 3 trademark pipes, thus giving him his singing voice. The main conflict in this story arc is the obscurity of such an idea and the bureaucracy preventing a simple wish becoming reality. Why do the simple things have to be so complicated by default? Future story arcs included Ivor discovering a family of dragons. Come on, this is Wales, what do you expect? Befriending an injured circus elephant and her slightly politically incorrect keeper, which you would never get away with nowadays, and the general ongoings that running a railway tends to entail, earning a living, adverse weather conditions, inferior modern traction, and so on. One of the defining aspects of the show was the form of stop-motion animation that Postgate chose for most of his 2D animated work. The characters and vehicles were brought to life as cardboard cutouts made up of several intricate limbs, heads and joints set flat against watercolour backdrops. Its simplicity was the key to this form of animation. By allowing the characters' gestures and expressions to change but forbidding any mouth or lip movement, Postgate was able to animate up to 120 seconds of stop-motion film in a day. By contrast, the production of a Wallace and Gromit film would average about 3.5 seconds of animation in a day. And while the level of detail is completely different in both styles, the stop-motion in Ivor the Engine somehow doesn't come across as completely lifeless. An example closer to home is perhaps Ivor Wood's adaptations of the Paddington stories from the 1970s. The bear is the only 3D animated character in this 2D cardboard world. The other characters have more expressions than Postgate's work, but when you put the two side by side, the more expressive universe looks like the less interesting because it's mostly unpainted, indicating to the casual observer that the studio didn't have money in the budget for colour. Yeah, I'm sure there's more to it than that, and I can appreciate the lack of colour helps the viewer to realise that this is a character out of his comfort zone, and no, I'm not saying the 70s version of Paddington was bad. But when the two worlds collide, I think I'd rather get lost in this one simply because it looks more pleasant. Though it would be nice if I could take the curious vegetarian bear with me. Anyways, back on topic. If there's any criticism to have with Ivor the Engine, it's that the show's motivation is fairly low-key most of the time, as there's no real antagonist, nor any great deal of friction in some of the stories, even compared to other small films productions. Bagpuss occasionally threw in jibes at workers going on strike around the time it was on air. This was the mid-1970s when British Leyland's workforce were on strike most of the time. The clangers implied that mankind had made planet Earth unattractive, and the social commentary in the saga of Noggin the Nog was even less subtle. The Omrud's story arc implied that perhaps we should be careful about things getting out of hand when developing the ways of science and technology, and the chapters on Firecake were basically allowing Postgate to express his views about the dangers of developing nuclear weapons. When should mankind just leave well enough alone instead of pursue wanton destruction by introducing explosives? Whereas Ivor's contribution to social commentary seems to be not to modernise small communities who would rather control their own way of living, thank you very much. The status quo is only maintained because there just so happens to be a rich person in town who's on the side of the locals in the form of Mrs. Porty. But what it lacks in friction and complexity that audiences take for granted these days, Ivor the Engine more than makes up for in terms of charm. Much like Winnie the Pooh, there's no political agenda or obvious moral being forced down everybody's throats every other minute. It has that certain soft appeal that makes people want to escape and keep coming back for more down the generations, simply because of how nice it is. With the world slowly reaching new heights of absurdity and confusion every passing day, it's nice to escape to a place where there's no reliance on time or the outside world, despite being fully aware of both. The show ran for 32 episodes in black and white, with many being remade for a colour television series of 40 episodes in the 1970s. The latter was eventually released on DVD, while the former got little beyond a limited VHS release of the first 6 episodes in the 1990s. Apart from a series of adverts for the BBC's digital TV service in Wales around the early 2000s, that seemed to be the end of Ivor's possible renaissance. Or so everybody thought. At the 2010 Canterbury Animation Festival, there was talk from Oliver Postgate's son Daniel of the remaining black and white episodes being recovered following his father's passing in 2008. But little has been done beyond repeating a few of them on streaming service Big Centre TV as part of the Boston Bear Club, the black and white films easily being the best part of that show. What happens from here with Ivor remains to be seen, but as Universal currently holds the rights to the show and they can apparently get a bit cliquey when it comes to black and white releases of niche historic TV, it looks like it's anybody's guess at this point. Ivor the Engine is one of the more pleasant examples of cult British television to have come out of the 20th century. If you find yourself unable to escape from the madness that the real world keeps coming to and you haven't checked it out yet, then maybe its laid-back nature could help you switch off and forget about your troubles for at least a few minutes at a time. I'm Chris, and I'm here to gauge the issue.